Some promises are never meant to be understood by the world. Only by the person they were written to. Rain slid down the tall glass windows of the halcyon room like melted silver, blurring the lights of midtown Manhattan into streaks of gold and white beneath the stormy November sky. Inside, the restaurant glowed with the quiet arrogance of old money. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors. Soft piano notes drifted through the air like smoke. The scent of aged bourbon, cedarwood, and black truffle lingered beneath the low murmur of conversations worth more than most people's mortgages. At exactly 8:17 p.m., the atmosphere changed. It always did when Nathaniel Wolfe arrived. The maitre d' straightened instantly. Conversation softened by half a breath. Even the waitstaff unconsciously adjusted their posture as the billionaire CEO stepped through the velvet-lined entrance with the calm gravity of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. Nathaniel Wolfe was not merely wealthy. Wealth was too small a word for men like him. He was the founder of Wolfe Dynamics, a global tech empire that controlled defense systems, satellite communications, and enough artificial intelligence patents to make entire governments nervous. Forbes once called him the man building the future before the rest of the world understands it. Tonight, however, Nathaniel Wolfe looked nothing like the titan from magazine covers. His charcoal overcoat carried droplets of rain across the shoulders. The silver at his temples seemed sharper beneath the amber light. And behind his pale blue eyes sat something far heavier than power. Weariness. The kind no amount of money could negotiate away. "Mr. Wolfe," the maitre d' greeted carefully. "Your usual room is prepared." Nathaniel gave a silent nod and walked deeper into the restaurant, past tables filled with venture capitalists, politicians, surgeons, and celebrities pretending not to stare. He moved alone. No security team. No assistant. Just the soft echo of polished Italian shoes against marble tile. Claire Whitmore noticed him immediately. She always did. From behind the service station near the wine wall, she watched quietly as he entered the private dining room at the far end of the restaurant. Her expression never changed. She simply lifted a silver tray and continued polishing crystal glasses with the precise, economical movements of someone who had mastered the art of invisibility. Claire was 27 years old, though the stillness in her gray eyes made her seem older. Her blonde hair was pulled into a clean low bun beneath the warm glow of the dining room lights. The black uniform of the halcyon room fit her perfectly, crisp and understated, making her blend seamlessly into the background of wealth she served every night. Most customers barely remembered her face after leaving. Claire preferred it that way. "Table 12 requested the Bordeaux pairing," another server whispered beside her. Claire nodded once. Calm. Silent. Controlled. Then the sound came. A sharp crack against wood from inside Nathaniel Wolfe's private room. Every head nearby turned instinctively toward the noise. Claire's hand stopped moving for the briefest fraction of a second. Through the partially open door, Nathaniel Wolfe stood beside the fireplace, one hand pressed against the edge of the mahogany table. In front of him rested an old parchment document sealed beneath glass. His voice cut through the room low, cold, and exhausted all at once. 20 years, he said. 20 years, and not one person has been able to tell me what my father meant before he died. Silence swallowed the room. Even the piano player seemed to hesitate. Nathaniel looked down at the parchment with something dangerously close to hatred. Linguists failed. Historians failed. Cryptographers failed. His jaw tightened. Tonight was apparently no different. Claire felt her breath catch. Only slightly. Barely enough for anyone to notice. But her eyes lowered toward the parchment beneath the glass, and for the first time that evening, something inside her expression changed. Recognition. The private dining room remained silent long after Nathaniel Wolfe finished speaking. The fire behind him crackled softly inside the marble fireplace, throwing restless gold reflections across the dark oak walls. On the table beneath the chandelier rested the parchment that had consumed 2 decades of his life. It looked fragile. Ancient. A faded sheet of cream-colored paper covered in strange symbols, uneven slashes, and fragmented lines of text written in dark brown ink that time had nearly erased. Yet everyone in Manhattan's elite circles knew about it. The wolf vow. Some called it a code. Others called it the final confession of a dying genius. Nathaniel called it unfinished business. Claire steadied the crystal glass in her hand and forced herself to look away. "You okay?" another waitress whispered beside her. Claire blinked once. "Fine." Her voice was calm, almost distant. The other waitress frowned slightly before hurrying toward another table carrying a tray of sea bass and wine pairings. Claire remained still for a moment longer. Her pulse had changed. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to notice. But inside her mind, old memories had already begun unfolding like dust-covered maps. The symbols on the parchment were not random. They only appeared random to people who looked at language as words instead of patterns. Nathaniel exhaled sharply and poured himself another glass of whiskey. "Dr. Holloway could not solve it," he said bitterly to the small group gathered around the table. "Neither could Princeton. Neither could the Naval Archives." One of the guests adjusted his tie carefully. "Perhaps your father intended it to remain private." Nathaniel laughed once. Cold. Empty. "My father never did anything without purpose." His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the glass. "Especially not before dying." Claire moved quietly through the dining room carrying a silver coffee service, but every word reached her clearly. The halcyon room had been designed for discretion. Thick velvet drapes absorbed noise. Conversations dissolved into the warm jazz drifting from the piano near the bar. But Claire had always been unusually good at hearing what others missed. As she approached the private room again, she caught sight of the parchment beneath the glass. Only for a second. But it was enough. Her stomach tightened instantly. There. Near the lower corner. A symbol hidden between two Latin abbreviations. Most people would have mistaken it for a decorative flourish in the handwriting. Claire knew better. It was directional notation. Maritime. 19th century. Her father used to teach her how to identify them during long winter nights in Boston when snowstorms rattled the windows of their tiny apartment. She could still hear his voice sometimes. "Codes are rarely meant to hide information, Claire. Usually they protect emotion." She looked away quickly. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the dark window beside the table. Calm gray eyes. Neutral expression. Invisible again. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. "Every year," one of the investors said carefully, "you bring this here hoping someone will solve it." Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city skyline. Finally he spoke. "No." His voice lowered. "I bring it here because this was my father's favorite restaurant." The room quieted again. Something shifted beneath the billionaire's cold exterior then. Not weakness. Something sadder. Loneliness polished into discipline over too many years. Claire noticed the untouched plate in front of him. The glass of whiskey already half empty. The exhaustion around his eyes that no magazine photograph ever captured. She turned slightly to leave when Nathaniel suddenly spoke again. "Wait." Claire stopped. Slowly she faced him. Nathaniel studied her for the first time that evening. Not as staff. Not as background. As a person. "You were looking at it," he said. Claire remained perfectly composed. "At the parchment, sir." The room's attention shifted toward her immediately. One of the guests smirked faintly. Nathaniel's pale eyes narrowed with quiet curiosity. "Do you understand any of it?" Claire glanced once toward the faded symbols beneath the glass. Then back at him. "No, sir," she said softly. "But I think whoever wrote it was afraid." The words lingered in the private dining room long after Claire spoke them. "I think whoever wrote it was afraid." No one responded immediately. The fire cracked softly behind Nathaniel Wolfe, filling the silence with the low hiss of burning cedarwood. One of the investors let out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. Another guest exchanged an amused glance across the table. To them, She was still just a waitress standing beside a billionaire's impossible obsession. Nathaniel, however, did not laugh. His eyes remained fixed on Claire with a level of attention that felt almost surgical. "Afraid of what?" he asked finally. Claire lowered her gaze respectfully. "Losing something, sir." Her answer came gently, but it landed in the room with strange weight. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Across the table, a gray-haired linguistics professor named Dr. Everett Holloway adjusted his glasses with visible annoyance. He had spent nearly 3 years studying the parchment for Nathaniel. "With respect," Holloway interrupted, "fear has nothing to do with the structure of the text. The document is a hybrid cipher. Symbolic compression mixed with archaic Latin derivatives. Emotional interpretation is irrelevant." Claire nodded politely. "Of course." Holloway leaned back, clearly satisfied with himself. Nathaniel, however, continued watching her. "And yet," he said slowly, "you noticed something after one glance that Dr. Holloway never mentioned in 3 years." Holloway frowned immediately. "Nathaniel, surely we are not entertaining. What did you notice?" Nathaniel asked, cutting him off without looking away from Claire. The room quieted again. Claire felt every eye settle onto her, but her expression remained composed. She had learned long ago that the more invisible people believed you were, the more dangerous it became to reveal intelligence too quickly. "Nothing important," she answered carefully. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. "That is not what I asked?" Claire hesitated for the first time that evening. "Only slightly." Outside the windows, rainwater crawled down the glass and silver streams, distorting the lights of Fifth Avenue below. Somewhere near the piano bar, someone laughed softly at another table, blissfully unaware that the atmosphere inside the private room had shifted completely. Claire finally spoke. "There is a directional marker near the lower section of the parchment," she said quietly. Dr. Holloway scoffed instantly. "Impossible," Claire continued as though he had not spoken. "It resembles decorative penmanship, but it is not decorative. It is maritime notation." Holloway leaned forward sharply. "That symbol has already been analyzed." Claire met his eyes calmly for the first time. "Then it was analyzed incorrectly." Silence. Nathaniel slowly stood from his chair. The movement alone changed the energy of the room. He walked toward the parchment beneath the glass case and stared down at the faded symbols with renewed focus. "Show me," he said. Claire did not move. "Sir, I should return to my section." Claire. Hearing her name from him felt strangely personal. He looked at her carefully now, not with arrogance, but curiosity layered over exhaustion. "Please!" The single word surprised everyone at the table. Claire stepped closer to the parchment at last. The warm light from the chandelier reflected softly across the glass surface as she leaned slightly forward. She did not touch the document. "There," she said gently, pointing toward a nearly invisible slash hidden between 2 fragments of Latin text. "That marking indicates protected coordinates." Holloway shook his head immediately. "No. That symbol was common in monastic scripts during the late 1800s. Claire nodded once. "Yes. But only when copied inland." Holloway's expression faltered slightly. Claire continued in the same calm voice. "At sea, the same symbol meant something different." Nathaniel stared at her. "How do you know that?" Claire's eyes lingered briefly on the parchment. For a moment, the elegant dining room around her seemed very far away. "Because my father spent his life teaching people how to hide messages where no one would think to look." Dr. Holloway's face tightened beneath the amber chandelier light. The older man adjusted his glasses again, but this time the gesture lacked confidence. "With respect," he said carefully, "maritime notation from the 19th century would not appear in a private family document unless the writer had naval training." Claire remained still beside the table, one hand lightly resting against the silver coffee tray she still carried. "He did," she answered softly. Nathaniel Wolfe looked up sharply. "My father served in naval intelligence before Wolf Dynamics existed." The room went quiet again. Holloway opened his mouth, then closed it. Nathaniel stared down at the parchment, as though seeing it for the first time in years. Outside the tall windows, rain continued sliding down the glass in long silver streaks while traffic crawled through Manhattan far below like distant rivers of light. Somewhere beyond the private room, the piano player transitioned into a slower jazz standard that drifted through the restaurant with melancholy warmth. Claire could feel the shift happening now. The room no longer saw her as background. That was dangerous. "What exactly are you saying?" Nathaniel asked. Claire hesitated. Not because she lacked the answer, but because answers changed people once spoken aloud. "I think the document was written by someone trained to disguise emotional language as operational language," she said carefully. "Military intelligence officers did that often during the Cold War. Especially officers who spent years encrypting information emotionally as well as strategically." Holloway frowned deeply. "That theory is highly speculative." Claire nodded politely. "Yes." Nathaniel studied her in silence. The billionaire's sharp blue eyes carried something unfamiliar now. Hope. Careful hope. The kind people are afraid to touch because disappointment has already cost them too much. He slowly pulled out the chair beside him. "Sit down." The request froze the room more effectively than shouting ever could. One of the investors nearly dropped his wine glass. Claire immediately shook her head. "Sir, I cannot." "You can." Nathaniel's tone remained calm, but final. "For the next few minutes you are not staff." Claire glanced toward the dining room entrance instinctively, half expecting the restaurant manager to intervene. But no one moved. Everyone was watching. Slowly, cautiously, Claire placed the silver tray onto the side table and sat at the far end beside the parchment. Up close, the faded ink looked even older. Time had cracked portions of the writing into delicate fractures across the paper. Nathaniel rested one hand beside the glass case without touching it. "My father wrote this 3 days before he died," he said quietly. "He left it in a locked safe with one instruction." Claire looked toward him. "What instruction?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. "He said only one person would ever understand it." Claire felt something cold move through her chest. Holloway folded his arms defensively. "Conveniently vague." Nathaniel ignored him completely. "For 20 years," he continued, "I assumed he meant a scholar. Someone extraordinary." Claire's eyes lowered toward the faded symbols again. The longer she looked, the clearer the emotional architecture became. This was not a puzzle built to keep strangers out. It was built to let one specific person in. "No," Claire whispered before realizing she had spoken aloud. Nathaniel leaned slightly closer. "What?" Claire swallowed carefully. "I do not think your father expected a genius." Nathaniel stared at her. Claire's fingers tightened slightly against her lap as old memories surfaced again. Her father teaching her ancient ciphers beside stacks of weathered books. Long nights translating fragmented naval archives while snow fell outside their apartment windows. His voice repeating the same lesson over and over. The safest place to hide truth is inside something people are too proud to understand emotionally. Claire finally looked back at Nathaniel. "I think your father expected someone who loved him enough to stop looking for a code." Silence settled over the room with almost physical weight. Even Holloway said nothing this time. Nathaniel slowly exhaled, but the sound carried years inside it. Then, for the first time that evening, his voice lost all traces of corporate authority. "And if you are right," he asked quietly, "what exactly was he trying to say?" Claire did not answer immediately. The firelight moved softly across the glass protecting the parchment, while rain continued tapping against the windows high above Manhattan. Nathaniel Wolfe stood beside her now instead of across from her, close enough for her to notice the faint exhaustion beneath the expensive cologne and perfectly tailored suit. He smelled like cedarwood, smoke, and sleepless nights. Around them, the private dining room had fallen into complete silence. Even the investors who normally dominated conversations with billion-dollar confidence sat motionless beneath the amber glow of the chandelier. Claire studied the parchment carefully. The symbols no longer looked confusing to her. They looked lonely. That was the difference no one else had understood. Your father was not hiding information, she said softly. He was hiding guilt. Dr. Holloway immediately shook his head. That is interpretation, not translation. Claire glanced toward him calmly. Language is interpretation. Holloway opened his mouth to argue, but Nathaniel raised one hand slightly without looking away from Claire. The gesture alone ended the interruption. Nathaniel's voice lowered. Go on. Claire leaned closer to the parchment without touching it. Her eyes followed the uneven spacing between the lines, the deliberate breaks in the symbols, the tiny directional markings hidden within the text. Suddenly the structure became painfully clear. Not a code. A confession disguised as navigation. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. The message changes depending on where you begin reading, she whispered. Nathaniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Claire pointed gently toward the lower right corner beneath a faded cluster of Latin abbreviations. Everyone started here because this appears to be the opening line. She moved her finger slightly higher. But this symbol redirects the reader emotionally, not grammatically. Holloway looked genuinely confused now. Claire continued quietly. It means the writer did not want the message understood logically first. He wanted it felt first. Nathaniel stared at her in silence. Claire inhaled slowly before speaking again. The document does not begin with the vow. Her voice softened further. It begins with the apology. Something shifted visibly in Nathaniel's expression then. Tiny. Almost invisible. But Claire saw it immediately. Fear. Real fear. The kind powerful men spend entire lives burying beneath ambition. Nathaniel looked down at the parchment again as though it might wound him simply by existing. Read it, he said quietly. Claire hesitated. Sir, please. The word barely rose above a whisper this time. Claire lowered her eyes toward the faded ink. For a moment, the restaurant disappeared around her. No crystal glasses. No billionaires. No polished marble floors. Only the fragile handwriting of a man who had run out of time before he ran out of regret. She began slowly. To my son. The room went perfectly still. If you are reading this, Claire translated softly, then I was too much of a coward to say these things while I was alive. Nathaniel's breathing changed slightly beside her. Claire continued carefully, following the emotional structure hidden beneath the coded symbols. I taught you how to win. I taught you how to survive. But somewhere along the way, I taught you to become alone. One of the investors quietly lowered his eyes. Dr. Holloway said nothing now. Claire's voice remained calm, but something inside it carried quiet sorrow. I did not build this cipher to protect secrets from strangers. Her eyes moved across the next line. I built it because I knew only someone who understood loneliness would ever read it correctly. Nathaniel slowly sat down beside the fireplace, as though his legs no longer trusted themselves completely. The billionaire who intimidated presidents and negotiated trillion-dollar contracts suddenly looked very far away from power. Claire reached the final visible section of the encoded message. Her throat tightened unexpectedly before she spoke. Forgive me, she translated quietly, for teaching you to hide every feeling except strength. Silence filled the room completely. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Nathaniel stared into the fire, unmoving, one hand pressed against his mouth as though trying to steady something invisible inside himself. Then, after a very long moment, he asked the question no one else in the room was brave enough to ask. How? He said softly. Did you know where to begin reading? Claire looked down at the parchment for several seconds before answering. The firelight flickered softly across the faded ink while the city beyond the windows shimmered beneath rain and midnight traffic. The halcyon room continued moving around them in hushed elegance. Waiters carried silver trays between candlelit tables. Crystal glasses chimed softly beneath low conversation. But inside the private dining room, time itself seemed to have slowed. Nathaniel Wolfe sat motionless in the leather chair near the fireplace, his eyes fixed not on the parchment anymore, but on Claire. Waiting. Claire finally spoke in a quiet voice. Because people who are afraid of losing love rarely hide their feelings in the beginning of a message. Nathaniel's expression tightened faintly. Claire folded her hands carefully in her lap, suddenly aware that she had already revealed far more about herself than she intended. They hide them at the center, she continued softly, where only someone patient enough to stop searching for power would ever think to look. Dr. Holloway stared at her with open disbelief now. You are describing emotional architecture as though it were mathematics. Claire glanced toward him politely. Sometimes it is. Nathaniel lowered his gaze toward the whiskey glass beside him. The ice had nearly melted completely. My father believed emotions made people weak, he said quietly. Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, sir. Nathaniel slowly raised his eyes again. Claire's voice remained calm. I think your father believed emotions made people vulnerable. The distinction settled heavily across the room. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, staring into the fire again. His reflection moved faintly in the dark window behind him, blurred by rainwater and city lights. For the first time all evening, he looked less like the man who commanded billion-dollar negotiations and more like a son sitting alone with a ghost he never truly understood. You speak as though you knew him, Nathaniel murmured. Claire lowered her eyes immediately. I did not. But the answer carried hesitation. Nathaniel noticed. Men like him always noticed hesitation. Then who taught you to read people this way? Claire remained silent for a moment too long. Outside the private room, the piano player shifted into a slower melody that drifted through the restaurant like memory itself. Finally she answered. My father. Nathaniel waited. Claire's fingers tightened slightly together beneath the table. He worked in military cryptology for 27 years, she said quietly. After he retired, universities hired him to teach advanced symbolic decryption. Holloway's expression changed instantly. What was his name? Claire hesitated again. Daniel Whitmore. The reaction was immediate. Holloway's eyes widened behind his glasses. One of the investors quietly muttered under his breath. Nathaniel looked toward Holloway sharply. You know the name? Holloway stared at Claire with sudden realization. Daniel Whitmore wrote the Oxford Framework on Emotional Cipher Structures in 1998. Claire said nothing. Holloway looked genuinely stunned now. His work changed modern decryption theory. Nathaniel slowly turned back toward Claire. And you never mentioned this? Claire gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. Most people do not ask waitresses about cryptology. For the first time that evening, something close to amusement flickered briefly across Nathaniel Wolfe's face. Small. Brief. But real. Then it vanished beneath something heavier. Your father, Nathaniel said carefully, would have understood this document immediately. Claire looked down toward the parchment again. The faded ink reflected softly beneath the chandelier light. No, she answered quietly. He would have understood your father immediately. Nathaniel fell silent again. Claire could feel the emotional gravity in the room growing stronger now, pulling years of unresolved grief closer to the surface. She should have excused herself. Returned to serving tables. Returned to invisibility. But instead she found herself staring at the final unread section hidden beneath the lower edge of the parchment. Her breath slowed. Something there felt different. Not apology. Warning. Claire leaned slightly closer to the glass. Nathaniel noticed immediately. What is it? He asked softly. Claire's eyes narrowed faintly as she followed the final sequence of symbols hidden beneath the directional markings. Then her expression changed completely. Not shock. Recognition. Deep and immediate. Nathaniel stood at once. Claire. She looked up at him slowly, her voice almost a whisper now. Your father was not writing to you alone. The words settled over the private dining room like a sudden drop in temperature. Nathaniel Wolfe stared at Claire without blinking, the firelight flickering across the sharp lines of his face while rain continued sliding down the dark Manhattan windows behind him. What do you mean? he asked quietly. Claire looked back toward the parchment beneath the glass case. Her pulse had begun to rise now. Not from fear of Nathaniel, but from the realization unfolding piece by piece in front of her. For 20 years, everyone had assumed the document was written as a final message from father to son. But the emotional structure hidden inside the cipher did not support that theory completely. Something else was there. Someone else. Claire leaned slightly closer, studying the lower section again. The faded symbols suddenly felt painfully familiar. Not because she had seen the document before. Because she had seen the pattern before. In her father's notes. "Claire," Nathaniel said again, softer this time. "Tell me." She swallowed carefully. "The directional markers shift halfway through the message." Holloway frowned immediately. "That is impossible. The pattern remains consistent across the entire structure." Claire shook her head once. "No. The emotional perspective changes." Holloway looked irritated again, but Nathaniel remained silent, listening with complete focus now. Claire pointed gently toward a nearly invisible sequence hidden between the lower lines of Latin shorthand. "Up here, the writer speaks as a father." Her finger moved lower. "But here," her voice faltered slightly, "here he speaks as a witness." Nathaniel's expression hardened faintly. "Witness to what?" Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, hearing her father's voice in memory once again. Codes are never only about information. They are about what people cannot survive saying out loud. When she opened her eyes again, the answer felt unavoidable. "Your father was protecting someone." Nathaniel stared at her. "Who?" Claire followed the final symbols slowly, translating silently inside her mind before speaking. "I could not tell him the truth." Nathaniel's breathing slowed. Claire continued quietly. "Not because he was weak, but because he loved too deeply to survive it." The room had gone completely still again. Holloway no longer interrupted. One of the investors quietly loosened his tie as though the air itself had become heavier. Nathaniel stepped closer to the parchment. "Who is he talking about?" Claire hesitated. "I am not entirely certain yet." Then her eyes moved toward the final line hidden beneath the edge of the document. Her stomach tightened instantly. There. One phrase remained partially encrypted through mirrored directional notation. An old intelligence technique designed to conceal names emotionally connected to the reader. Claire's breath caught softly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "You found something." It was not a question. Claire looked up at him slowly. "There is another message underneath the apology." Nathaniel's pale blue eyes sharpened instantly. "Read it." Claire studied the symbols carefully. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "If Nathaniel ever learns what happened on the winter crossing..." She stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath around her. Nathaniel's expression changed completely. "The winter crossing," he repeated quietly. Claire nodded faintly. "Does that phrase mean something to you?" Nathaniel looked away toward the fire. For the first time all evening, genuine shock broke through his carefully controlled composure. "My father disappeared for 11 days during a classified naval operation in 1987. Claire remained silent. Nathaniel continued slowly, almost speaking to himself now. "When he came back, he was different." The billionaire's voice carried something fragile beneath it now. Memory. "He never explained what happened." Claire looked back toward the parchment again, her chest tightening unexpectedly. "I think he tried to explain it here." Nathaniel stared at her. Claire's eyes followed the final encrypted line one last time before she spoke the words carefully. "This was never a confession about failure." The fire crackled softly behind them. "It was a confession about sacrifice." Nathaniel's face went pale beneath the amber light. Claire slowly looked up from the parchment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried quiet certainty. "Your father believed someone innocent paid the price for his survival." No one in the private dining room moved after Claire spoke those words. The rain against the windows sounded louder now, steady and relentless against the dark Manhattan skyline. Nathaniel Wolfe remained standing beside the fireplace, one hand resting against the edge of the mahogany table as though the room itself had shifted beneath him. His father believed someone innocent paid the price for his survival. The sentence lingered heavily in the warm amber air between crystal glasses and untouched whiskey. Dr. Holloway slowly removed his glasses, staring down at the parchment with the hollow expression of a man realizing he had spent years solving the wrong problem. Nathaniel's voice came carefully now, stripped of authority, stripped even of pride. Who? Claire looked back toward the faded symbols beneath the glass. The final encrypted sequence remained incomplete, hidden beneath layered directional notation designed not only to conceal information, but to force emotional hesitation in the reader. It was cruelly intelligent. Human. I do not know yet, she admitted softly. But your father was terrified of this person being remembered incorrectly. Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. Remembered as what? Claire's eyes moved slowly across the final line. A betrayal. The fire cracked sharply behind them, sending brief gold light dancing across the room. Nathaniel looked down as though something painful had surfaced from very far away. There was someone, he said quietly. The investors exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. Nathaniel continued slowly, almost unwillingly. After the winter crossing operation, one officer resigned immediately. Claire listened carefully. My father never spoke his name again, Nathaniel said. Not once. Claire felt the final pieces beginning to settle together inside her mind. Because your father blamed himself. Nathaniel looked up sharply. Claire inhaled slowly before continuing. This document was not written to protect his reputation. It was written to protect someone else's. Holloway frowned faintly. That would explain the mirrored emotional encoding. Claire nodded once. The cipher redirects guilt away from the writer. Nathaniel stared at the parchment with growing disbelief. You are telling me my father spent 20 years protecting another man? Claire's voice softened. I think he spent 20 years punishing himself. Silence filled the room again. Outside the private dining room, servers moved quietly through the restaurant carrying candlelit desserts and bottles of expensive wine, while jazz drifted softly beneath the low murmur of wealth and polished conversation. But inside the room, none of it seemed real anymore. Nathaniel Wolfe slowly lowered himself back into the leather chair beside the fire, staring into the flames with distant eyes. Claire studied him carefully. The powerful billionaire the world feared was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by a son finally standing face to face with his father's grief. Then Nathaniel spoke again, barely above a whisper. There was a photograph. Claire looked toward him. Nathaniel swallowed once before continuing. When I was 12, I found an old naval picture hidden inside my father's desk. His eyes remained fixed on the fire. There were 6 men standing on a ship in heavy snow. Claire felt a strange tightness in her chest. One face had been scratched out completely. The room fell still again. Nathaniel's voice lowered further. I asked my father who it was. Claire waited silently. Nathaniel finally looked at her. He told me some people deserve to disappear from history. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not from shock. From sadness. Because now she understood the final emotional structure hidden inside the cipher. The scratched-out man was not the villain of the story. He was the wound. Claire slowly opened her eyes again and looked toward the final encrypted line beneath the glass. Her voice came quietly. Your father did not erase him because he hated him. Nathaniel stared at her. Claire's eyes softened faintly. He erased him because remembering him hurt too much. Nathaniel's composure finally cracked then. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just a slow lowering of his head as years of misunderstood silence settled over him all at once. Claire watched the billionaire sit there beneath the amber firelight, surrounded by wealth powerful enough to influence nations, and understood something simple and devastating. Some people spend their entire lives becoming successful because they never learned how to survive being forgiven. The fire had burned lower by the time the silence finally loosened its grip on the private dining room. Beyond the rain-streaked windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath midnight clouds and endless rivers of headlights flowing through the city below. Inside the halcyon room, the dinner crowd had thinned into quieter conversations and half-empty wine glasses. The piano near the bar played softly now, each note carrying the tired elegance of a city that never truly slept. Nathaniel Wolfe remained seated beside the fireplace, staring into the fading flames as though they might still contain answers hidden somewhere inside them. The parchment rested untouched beneath the glass case on the table between him and Claire. But everything about it had changed. For 20 years, Nathaniel had treated it like a problem to conquer. Tonight, for the first time, it felt human. Claire slowly stood from her chair. The movement was gentle enough that no one reacted immediately. She picked up the silver tray she had set aside nearly an hour earlier, returning instinctively to the quiet posture of a waitress preparing to disappear back into the background. Nathaniel looked up at her at once. "You are leaving?" Claire gave a faint nod. "My shift is almost over." Nathaniel stared at her for several seconds. The billionaire who once intimidated boardrooms with a single glance suddenly seemed uncertain of how to hold on to a conversation that mattered. "Claire." She paused. "Yes, sir?" Nathaniel glanced toward the parchment again. "Do you think my father ever forgave himself?" The question settled softly between them. Claire looked at the fading firelight reflected across the glass case before answering. "No." Nathaniel lowered his eyes slightly. But Claire continued quietly. "I think he hoped you would." Nathaniel looked back at her immediately. Claire's expression remained calm, though something in her eyes carried quiet understanding now. "Some people spend so much time punishing themselves," she said softly. "They forget forgiveness was never supposed to come from them." The room fell silent again. Holloway sat motionless beside the table, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Even the investors looked thoughtful now, stripped of the detached confidence money often gave men who rarely examined their own regrets too closely. Nathaniel slowly stood to his feet. "How much do they pay you here?" One of the investors shifted awkwardly at the sudden question. Claire almost smiled. "Enough to pay rent." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened faintly. "You should not be carrying trays in a restaurant." Claire adjusted the silver tray lightly against her arm. "And yet here I am." For the first time all evening, a real smile appeared briefly at the corner of Nathaniel Wolfe's mouth. Small. Tired. Human. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and removed a sleek black business card trimmed in silver. He placed it carefully beside the parchment. "Wolf Dynamics has an entire division dedicated to historical intelligence systems." Claire looked at the card but made no move toward it. Nathaniel's voice softened. "We could use someone who understands that people are more complicated than algorithms." Claire studied him quietly for a moment. The billionaire standing before her no longer looked like the cold titan who entered the restaurant hours earlier. Grief had softened something inside him. Not weakness. Perspective. Finally she answered gently. "I appreciate the offer, sir." Nathaniel waited. Claire glanced once more toward the parchment beneath the glass. "But I think tonight was never really about solving a code." Nathaniel followed her gaze slowly. Claire's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "It was about hearing someone who had been trying to apologize for 20 years. The fire crackled softly behind them. Nathaniel looked down at the parchment again, and this time he no longer looked angry at it. Only sad? And strangely relieved. Claire turned toward the doorway then, disappearing once more into the warm golden atmosphere of the halcyon room. The other diners barely noticed her passing between the candlelit tables. To them, she was still only a quiet waitress carrying an empty silver tray through the fading hours of another Manhattan night. But Nathaniel Wolfe watched her until she vanished completely from sight. Then, slowly, he reached toward the parchment one final time and rested his hand gently against the glass protecting his father's words. Outside, rain continued falling over the city. Inside, for the first time in 20 years, the room no longer felt haunted. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the only ones quiet enough to hear the truths we spend our lives trying to outrun.